Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and we have the wonderful James Stevens Valliant, although he only says James Valliant in his bio at the bottom there. He's here today to talk to us about the comparison between Aristotle's epistemology and Ayn Rand's epistemology. Jim, welcome. Welcome back. Welcome
Thank
still.
welcome, still ongoing welcome. Thank you, and thank you for
Yes.
always being so welcoming. It's
It's-
always a pleasure, and you always uh, bring out the best in me and focus on really interesting topics. So it's a joy to be here, as always.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. I'm sure that there's some people watching that are like, what the hell is he talking about? Epistemology. They've never heard the term before. What is epistemology?
One of those 50-cent words, epistemology. It literally means the science of knowledge. It literally from its roots, and that's what it is. It is the branch of philosophy that attempts to describe how we know, how it is that humans come to know things when they do. Human beings can be mistaken on the conceptual level. Boy, we make mistakes on the conceptual level all the time. It requires the application of an objective methodology, logic and observation, not any old, throwing darts at the dartboard is going to work if you want knowledge at the conceptual level. You've got to deploy a certain methodology. And the key to that methodology, of course, is observation, i.e., sense perception and logic, both inductive and deductive logic. And that is the method that alone can yield valid conceptual knowledge. And so there have been other attempts at this. There have been epistemologists who said knowledge is impossible. And so the whole field of the science of knowledge, as we might broadly put it, is what we're talking about. And philosophers since the ancient Greeks have been trying to figure out how people know when they do know. How did they acquire that knowledge? And what is its
Yeah.
status? That's the subject of epistemology.
All right. Let me tell you what I know or what I think I know about Aristotelian epistemology, and you could elaborate and tell me where I'm wrong and tell me what I'm leaving out that's important. So the things that I find important in Aristotle's epistemology, first and foremost, his identification of the three laws of logic. A is A. A thing is what it is. The law of non-contradiction. The thing can't both be and not be at the same time, and either or. A thing either is or it isn't. It can't be in the middle. Then his theory of definition, which is more complex than what I'm going to state, but it breaks things down into genus and differentia. Very, very important development. He also, I left out, and I probably should have said it first, his idea that knowledge is acquired by the application of reason to experience, that it's all looking outward. It's how we gain, the evidence of the senses, and by the use of reason, we come to have knowledge. And his inventory of the categories, length, width, extension. I don't remember the exact categories he listed, action, things that aren't ideas that aren't things in themselves, but necessarily are properties or activities of another, of something like the man talks. So, or man acts. Action would be a category. Obviously, something has to do the acting. Or the thing is green. It has color, but there's no color independent of objects. So that is my brief summary of the Aristotelian epistemology. And now you can take over for a bit.
Well, in the field of epistemology, Aristotle is the first of the truly great epistemologists. His account of knowledge is basically the correct one. Prior to prior to Aristotle, Greeks had started philosophy and begun to think about these questions. There were extreme skeptics called the sophists who came along arguing against the validity of the senses and against the validity of all knowledge generally, and particularly against claims of moral knowledge. So you've got the sophists there being extreme skeptics about knowledge. You've got men like Socrates and Plato, as we read in the works of Plato and Xenophon, who are very eager to refute the sophists and their radical skepticism. But for them, knowledge is not based on the evidence of the senses. They sort of agreed with the sophists that sensory knowledge is unreliable. Even before this, there were pre-Socratics who were considering the problem of change. Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus says, it looks like there's objects in this world. I'll pick up my bottle of water. It looks like there's permanent, stable objects. That's just an illusion, said Heraclitus. If we see any kind of permanence, that is our eyes deceiving us, in effect. Everything is change. Everything is nothing. One of his famous, we infer these things because much of what we know about Heraclitus comes from brief aphorisms, saved by other philosophers like Diodorus of Sicily or Aristotle. But among these aphorisms, nothing is, everything is becoming. You can't step into the same river twice. And so all there really is change. And the ultimate element that he thought underneath everything, at least his followers certainly jumped on this, was fire. Fire, the agent of change, you see. But think about it. I light a match and I blow it out. Is it the same match or is it a different match? Well, it's the same and it's not the same. And so we have a big fat contradiction. Change implies a contradiction. Parmenides comes along and notes this and says, yes, he agrees in this respect, something is illusory, but as far as he's concerned, it's the change that's illusory. The only thing that really is the permanent. To be is to be, he says, and that's that. And so if we think that this match has changed, it's the change part that was the illusion. Something had to change. The match is still the match. It's the change part that your senses are deceiving you about. Aristotle comes along and says they're both wrong and they're both right. And, all these other guys, the sophists and the Platonists, are wrong too. He was really the first philosopher to give a all-in-out defense of sense perception. No, says Aristotle. The reality that we see when we open up our eyes is the reality I'm talking about. Plato had said, for example, that our senses were invalid because we see multiple horses. We see multiple men. In reality, for us to know that this is a horse, there must have been some innate knowledge that we had in our head of horseness. And this must come from the true reality, this world of forms where there's one perfect horse, the concept of horse in its essence. And from that, when I look at this confused and deceptive world that my senses give me, I see that's a horse, that's a horse, that's a horse. But all the differences between horses, all the actions horses take, that's all a sensory illusion. Aristotle flips the script on these guys. He says, no, what really exists are each of the individual things in question. So it's not horseness that has primary reality. It's Dobbin, Bobbin, Secretariat. Who's the horse that won yesterday at Saratoga Springs? The Belmont Stakes was recently run. Not at Belmont, Long Island, but we get the idea. Anyway, the individual particular thing, those individual horses are the reality here. We ourselves have the capacity to abstract the form of horseness, which is in the horse, from the individual differences between the horse. So it's a mental act of abstraction that creates our awareness of horseness, says Aristotle. Even though horseness, the form of it, is in the thing, we are able to mentally separate the unique features of each unique horse from the things that it shares with other horses. Furthermore, change is not a contradiction if you understand the law of non-contradiction. Getting to what you were saying about logic, Aristotle said, that match is the same match in a different respect at a different time. And so his formulation of the law of non-contradiction resolves this problem before we even get off the ground. In fact, the nature, Aristotle will go on to say, how a thing changes depends on what it is now. I can blow out the match and make it a burnt match, right? I cannot, by blowing it out, turn it into a pumpkin or turn it into Santa Claus. Its potential for change is defined by its current actual attributes. And so Aristotle is the defender of the validity of the senses. The world that we perceive with our senses directly is the real world he's talking about. The objects we perceive in that world are the reality, and our generalizations are mental things that human beings can do. And in doing that, we have to treat these abstractions in a rigorously logical way, he said. Now, you mentioned the foundational laws of logic. He did articulate the law of the excluded middle and non-contradiction. He really articulated non-contradiction. And he implies that this is true of all things simply because they are. It's true of what he says, being qua being. Nothing can contradict. In fact, every word I utter, horse, means I'm not talking about bananas, men, oranges. I'm talking about horses. For you to even understand the word horse suggests you are bought into, as a premise, the law of non-contradiction. So to be is to be non-contradictory. As such, things are what they are is the implication. But it took later Aristotelians in the Middle Ages to really define the law of identity explicitly, A is A, as we objectivists might put it. But you're right. Aristotle is put together now the correct account of human knowledge. One, all knowledge begins and arises out of sense experience. It can't be innate knowledge. He vigorously argues against Plato's argument for innate knowledge. He says, no, knowledge is derived from sensory experience, and we can rely on that sensory experience. He says, after all, we've got organs that are appropriate to this. And so we share with animals, he will say, the ability to see color, the ability to experience color. And it is a physical process. And like animals, we interact with reality such that we can see red. He defends the senses. He says all knowledge begins and arises out of sense experience. A radical improvement, the beginnings of what we can generally call, I don't want to distinguish this from the capital E modern school of empiricism that developed from Locke and forward, and of course, very strongly against 20th and 21st century, what they call empiricism. But Aristotle was the father of what we might generally call empiricism, that all to know we have to look. There's no causeless knowledge in that way. To know we must look, and all subsequent knowledge is some kind of processing of that sensory experience. The processing he thinks is important is this act of abstraction, where we can abstract the form horse from this particular horse. I have a capacity to see different horses, and I have this capacity called memory. Between my perception and my memory, I can go, horseness. I abstract away the horseness form. So he has at least a rudimentary idea of abstraction. His great achievement. And here, what can you say about Aristotle? His development of deductive logic is one of the monumental achievements of the human mind. Would you go to school and study as basic logic or formal logic, they'll call it, and I don't like that term. It's logic. It's deductive logic. But Aristotle pretty much laid out, there have been some modifications and additions. His students, as I say, in the Middle Ages and scholastic times, deeply influenced by him, did add to our knowledge of deductive logic a bit, but not much has been added to that sense. Literally, Aristotle laid out just about the entire science of deductive logic from A to Z and all the different forms and structures of what a valid argument would look like. Now, valid structural doesn't do it for Aristotle like it does for some of these modern logicians. To him, that's not the point. Our premises have to be based on our experience, abstractions that we make from experience.
Jim, hold on one second. Hold on one second, because you
Sure.
just said something. You said valid structural logic. Now let me give an example to make this clear.
Right.
If I were to say, according to modern logicians, all tigers can fly, Jim Valliant is a tiger, therefore Jim Valliant can fly, that would be a valid argument. The meaning is that the premises imply the conclusion, and there's no contradiction in there. The problem is, as you just stated, is that the premises are entirely false, because the classical syllogism is what they're called. The logical argument is a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. So you have Socrates is a man, or you have all men are mortal, which would be a major premise. Socrates is a man would be your minor premise. Therefore, Socrates is immortal would be is amortal would be your conclusion.
The way those two connect logically means that if the premises are correct, the conclusion must absolutely be correct.
Exactly. In
But
valid structure, they don't care about the truth or falsity of your premises.
Aristotle did.
Okay.
And like an objectivist, as an objectivist would say, it's not even valid logic because you didn't even get to your generalization validly. It may be formally, you may formally be correct, but that is still not the full test of validity. Truth is the test of validity for objectivism, and uh, done the at least the objective method is the test. That is to say, is the premise validly based, and that must come from this abstraction or induction, as we call it, a generalization from experience. If we're generalizing from experience, if we're forming a concept like table, horse, they don't just apply to that table or that horse. They apply to every and any table I might run across. That is a kind of generalization from a particular, but I need multiple instances of tables in order to draw that kind of generalization. In concept formation, it's the equivalent of Aristotle's abstraction, which Aristotle barely touched on. Or it can be when I have some concepts and I'm propositionally using them, I can test my proposition. First of all, how do I derive it? And then how do I test it? And there we usually is when the word induction kicks in. And Aristotle, this is where Aristotle, his account of knowledge from an objectivist standpoint is obviously so far wonderful, right? But one of the problems with Aristotle is that he had a very crude view of induction. He had nothing like the scientific method, the experimental method of controlling the factors so we can extract the exact cause. But
Right.
on the other hand, Aristotle was a believer in cause. He said, you really don't, you can say,
Four of them, right?
yep, there are different kinds of cause. And he believed that true understanding is when you reach understanding, and this only humans can do. That when they reach a conceptual, what we as objectivists call conceptual understanding of cause and effect with respect to something. Now you really know it when you've got the cause, says Aristotle. And again, we kind of agree with Aristotle there. He's a big believer in causation, and to truly understand is to understand cause, why it must act as it does under these conditions. But in getting to that causal knowledge, Aristotle is a little different from Ayn Rand. Aristotle believes that what we in effect do is we gather up observations, and what we're doing is we're creating sort of provisional generalizations, what we might call today correlations. Well, this always seems to go with that. And the more of this I get, the more of that I get. So let's go with the idea that this is generalization is true. And what we do is in any given science, and he believed that each science has its own principles and must be considered in its own way. So he was, in this sense, what they call sometimes a pluralist in epistemology. Each science should respect its own approach because its own subject dictates its own method and its own principles. And don't be lured by mathematics into using that as your model across the board. Don't be lured by ethics into thinking that's your model for knowing across the board. But all of the different sciences, and because of his whole approach, you see, he's really the father of different sciences precisely because of his approach. He slices up reality. See, you can slice it up, look at the living things, biology, slice it up, look at human societies, politics, slice up literature, poetics, slice up knowledge, logic, and observation. So each science has its own principles. Now, to get to the fundamental principles of each science, we sort of build up these provisional generalizations, these correlations through a process of what most philosophers, epistemologists, call induction by simple enumeration. How do I know all swans are white? Well, I've never run across a black swan. Every swan I've ever seen. I've seen hundreds of swans. I've seen thousands of swans. At some point, after never seeing a black swan, I say, well, all these thousands of swans are white. I'm going to have the provisional assertion, all swans are white. So with this generalization, and he understood the weakness of simple enumeration in terms of being able to confidently say all swans are white. He says, therefore, what we really need to do is develop these provisional generalizations in a structure becoming closer and ever closer to its first principles, the first principles of that science. And the first principles of that science should be, in effect, axiomatic. They should be obvious once you've studied all the details of that science. Oh, of course, this is what the basic principle is, and then we can turn around and use the deductive logic that Aristotle's worked out in such detail deductively. And if we can do that, if we can take a clearly obvious axiom that is true about all the things that we've learned about this science and deduce all the other sub principles from that, now Aristotle says we've got certainty. We've got certainty because we've got these definitive arguments that all stem from what is, at the end of these investigations, now an obvious axiom. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in essence, Aristotle's form of induction, which Hume was able to, of course, really wreak havoc with, is the idea that if you see enough of something occurring, you can count on it occurring. That gives, like, every man I've ever known has died, so all men die. Now, the difference from my understanding, there's two really big differences with Ayn Rand and Aristotle. The one is, you mentioned earlier essences, Plato's essences or metaphysical essences, where Plato felt that from memory, we must have been in another world where we experienced hoarseness or madness, and that's why we recognize it here. And where Aristotle rejected that, he nonetheless believed in concepts like madness. He just thought they were intrinsic to the object, and that's what you were selecting out, where Rand disagreed. And I'm going to have you explain why in a minute. And also in terms of this induction by just, because you've seen it, what do you call it? Induction by enumeration. Because you've seen it over and over again, you can count on it being true. Where Ayn Rand would say, no, it's the identity of a given thing that makes it act the way it acts. That's how we know it's true, by
Well,
learning its identity.
in effect, Aristotle did agree with that conception of causality. What a thing is determines all of its potentialities. Its actuality defines its potentiality. And so he does give the first clue to Ayn Rand's view of causation. That is to say, it is the attributes, the current attributes of the thing that determine how it must act under any given circumstances. Its potential, if you will, is defined by its actual. And Ayn Rand very much feeds it. Her theory of causation, or definition of causation, is much better explained. She better explains how we abstract it conceptually when we're young and how it serves as a foundation for all subsequent knowledge that we develop. But she agrees with Aristotle. You really don't know something till you know the causal principles of that scientific field. And those causal principles have to begin with observation within that field. But for her, now there is an argument about what Aristotle really is. The main school of interpreting Aristotle is the one I'm going to give you here. That form is that bottleness. I pick up my water bottle. Bottleness is the form that's in this thing. And why it becomes apparent to me with all the observations I'm going to make about bottleness is because that's its metaphysical form. Ayn Rand believes that the attributes are the attributes like Aristotle, only she thinks that the essence is epistemological. That is to say, what we regard as the defining attribute is dependent on our current context of knowledge. So she doesn't say that a thing is what its definition is. A concept is its constituent members. And so, for example, if I'm a child, if I'm a baby, and my first running definition of people is the big people that move around and feed me, that's a perfectly valid definition for a 3-year-old if he had the words for it. And then he sophisticates his definition. And Ayn Rand says, no, the thing that's most causally explicable that makes this different from all other things is the essence, but that's a matter of the context of our current knowledge. And so we say, she, again, agreeing with Aristotle, man is the rational animal. Rationality is what explains most of our differences with the other animals. They don't have art, science, the technology we do. They don't have senses of humor. They don't have, so the way we are and what makes us different, the things that make us different from the other members of our category, animals, can all pretty much be explained by this one feature. And that is, at least under our current context of knowledge, the correct definition, but it's correct because of our context of knowledge and the facts. There's nothing special about a certain form that impresses itself upon us that's metaphysically in there. There's no one feature of this that's going to dictate what my definition will be down the line.
Jim, I got
And
to take you to task about this.
okay,
I have to. You've started the discussion of concept formation at the end with definitions. So I want to back up a little bit.
we do need to back up.
Back up a little bit. I didn't really want to take you to task. I just wanted to get a segue to go back to the beginning.
That was a cool segue, though.
Because definition is the last step.
Right.
You have to provide
It
your
is.
concept of the definition. But the beginning of concept formation, like you said, is observation. But the base of all our knowledge and objectivism are axiomatic concepts. As far as I know, the discovery of axiomatic concepts was Rand's, but I don't know if she was influenced by someone else, but I've never seen them anywhere else. So what are axiomatic concepts, both in terms of what they are and specifically what are her axiomatic concepts? Like, what is an axiomatic concept definitionally, and what are the three big ones?
An axiom is a statement of the base of all further conceptual knowledge. It's really that simple. They are known through direct observation, but it's still a kind of conceptual knowledge. So, for example, take the law of identity, which is so important to logic. Aristotle himself said that to be is to be non-contradictory. Contradictions don't exist. And how do we know that? Aristotle would basically agree with Ayn Rand in the sense that we've abstracted from our observation. And that's what a concept of an axiom is. It's an abstraction from several observations of a universal fact, a fact that is present in every instance of sense perception. So the law of identity is true of everything I see, everything I hear. And at some point I see, well, that is what it is, that is what it is, that is what it is. And it's so ubiquitous that when I first form the concept identity, I do not need to name it or define it. There's nothing to distinguish it from, and I don't even need a name because it's just, that is what it is, that is what it is. And that's what an axiomatic concept is for Rand. This concept, this implicit, and it's a kind of concept, though. It's not a direct perception. I need to build up several perceptions, as with any other concept, like horse. I need to see a bunch of horses before I can get the concept horse. Similarly, with identity, all I need to see is a bunch of things. And at some point, oh, those things are what they are and can't be otherwise. That's the implicit knowledge. But it's let's take causation as it's a corollary to identity and action. Action is itself conceptual, isn't it? I see things move around, I see things still. And so I form the concept action. Armed with these concepts, action and identity, I then develop a relationship between the two. I see if I release a helium balloon, it goes up. If I release a brick, it falls to the ground. If I push the ball on a smooth surface, it rolls. If I push the ball on a rough surface, it stops quickly. That tells me something about the ball, the surface, and pushing. And I think, aha, the nature of a thing determines, I open my eyes, I see. I close my eyes, I don't see. That's another little lesson in causality, where I build up all these observations of the relationship between the thing's nature and the way it acts, and I come up with the implicit abstraction, which is really just what Ayn Rand would call a corollary to the law of identity as applied to action, because I have to have had these earlier basic concepts. On the other hand, it's a very low-level concept because it forms the basis for all of my subsequent understanding of action. Without this concept of causality, I cannot make any sense whatever about regularities of action at all in any of my subsequent knowledge, all the way up to the highest scientific abstraction.
So her three are axiomatic concepts, the three main ones: existence, identity, and consciousness. And the thing is, anybody who tries to argue against these has to use them. They're implied in any statement that I make. Whatever I say, it's about something that exists, and it's about something that exists. So it has to have identity. And the fact that I know about it says that I'm conscious of it. And so she shows that it's impossible. Any statement you make has these. So anybody that wants to defeat them has to use them, right? Which I think
Exactly.
is phenomenal. Now, I think it's important
All
to
that
note.
Notice that we come to know the axioms through this process of abstracting from our early experiences. And there's no more validation to them other than those direct observations from which I abstracted the axiom conceptually. That is the way it works in terms of validating and coming to know the axiom. When it comes to defending the axiom, all I'm doing is showing that it is an axiom, that it lies at the base of all other knowledge. So it is a self-contradiction to deny the axiom, because all I'm doing is pointing out all subsequent knowledge depends upon the axiom. I'm proving that it is an axiom. I'm not proving the truth of the axiom. The truth of the axiom is directly given to me through those observations.
Jim, I
And
need you to be a little more exact. You're not proving an axiom. You're validating an axiom.
validating it, well, no, I'm proving that it is an axiom.
Okay, you're proving that it is an axiom, but
I can prove this is the distinction I'm making.
okay.
I can prove its role in knowledge. I can prove that it is an axiom. I cannot prove the truth of its assertion that existence exists or that I am conscious in that manner. In
And
fact,
why?
all subsequent knowledge rests on it. So I can show the relationship of my knowledge one to the other in demonstrating that it is an axiom. All I'm doing is demonstrating that it is an axiom, that all subsequent knowledge depends upon it. That can be shown. But beyond observation, look, there's nothing more to add to existence. If you can't grasp existence from that, there's nothing I can do to give you any more information base to provide you the validity of existence. And the validity of the knowledge of existence must come from those observations. And then I reach the abstraction, existence. Now, we can only come to that when we're adults, and because sometimes we can get confused if we contradict our axiomatic knowledge at the higher levels. And this, again, can only happen at the higher levels of conceptual knowledge. I can end up contradicting myself about the axioms at that level. And so I need, as an adult, to self-consciously identify the axioms as axioms so that I know, hey, wait a minute, I'm contradicting myself without knowing it. And to give the example of the hierarchy of knowledge, the classic example we use is Proudhon's, all property is theft. Well, wait a minute here. You don't get to have the concept theft if there's no such thing as valid property. If there's no such thing as valid property, Proudhon, then how can you complain about theft? Theft bad, property bad, because property theft. No, it can't work that way. You're assuming the truth of valid property to get your concept theft off the ground so that someone's pissed off about being illegitimately taken from them in order to what? Invalidate the whole concept of property.
Yeah.
It's a giant contradiction.
Yeah.
Similarly, were I to say, and this is the best way to go about defending an axiom, simply, people will say, Jim, how do you know the axioms are correct? People disagree about the axioms. You just simply deny whatever reality they're using as their premise. No, people don't disagree. What do you mean? There's no such thing as disagreement. They say, well, no, obviously. Well, and by the way, I would say, but even if they do disagree, that's no consequence. What do you mean? If one person says A and the other person says non-A, we've got a problem here, Houston. Oh, okay. So you see, your whole problem was predicated on the truth of the law of non-contradiction. whether you knew it or not. You cannot use that knowledge to undermine my confidence in that knowledge later on. You've just assumed it. In fact, you've told me how any argument, any assertion must rely upon it. And the axioms are axiomatic knowledge in this way. They're metaphysical axioms. You'll notice the difference. I use the term action. That is a big, basic concept. It's not an axiom because it's not true of every experience I have. All three axioms are true of every experience I have. There's something that exists, I'm aware of it, and it is. That is something, it exists, I'm aware of it. And there is no moment of my awareness of existence or consciousness that is free of those. And so Ayn Rand says those three are the necessary base of any word you use, any knowledge you have. They must form the base of all subsequent knowledge. And they are directly given, the evidence for it is directly given in each and every observation that I will ever have and have had.
Now, it's important that in objectivism, Ayn Rand is not a geometrician and she's not a rationalist. So she doesn't start with axioms and then deduce an entire system a la Descartes. She uses the axioms as the base of knowledge, but the system is built up inductively. So take us.
We can use the word inductively in the broad sense of generalization.
That's what I mean. Yes.
Concept formation, which is itself a kind of generalization from observation. Yes. So sometimes induction is used only in the propositional sense. But if you mean generalization,
yes,
then yes, it's all an inductive generalization from my sense experience.
Right.
Right. And so, notice she'll strongly argue that no deductive argument is any stronger than its premises. And you've got to have valid inductive inference, and it's got to be validated first. And if we don't, then we could never be sure of any of our deductions. So she criticizes Aristotle in this respect. We could never get to the point where we can turn around and then deduce it and then be certain if our intermediate inferences were not themselves inductively valid.
Yes. So concepts. Take us through concept formation from identification and differentiation, or rather the identification of the class, the differentiating it from another class, the conceptual common denominator involved in the process, on through definition.
Well, what sense perception gives us immediately and directly are awareness of certain differences and similarities, a direct awareness of certain differences and similarities. And anyone opening their eyes can see that's red, that's green. I don't have words. I don't have the concept red or green, much less the concept table yet, which could be either red or green. So in making this category, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the particular now from a new perspective as a member of a group. And in order to classify this with other members of the group that share an observed, and it begins with observation. It's not going to end just with observation, but our first concepts directly from the similarities and differences that I perceive in the thing allow me to be able to categorize things based upon similarity and difference. Oh, green, 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 green. Now they may differ a little bit in the different shade of green that they are, but they are all in one group as opposed to red. And this may be a little brighter, this may be a little more saturated, this may be more vivid, this may be more pink, this may be more orange. But along the red spectrum, I say these are red things. Now, I've just given you the clue to Ayn Rand's answer there. Ayn Rand says that what we do is we find a commeasurable characteristic of the thing in reality, and we omit the measurements to form the concept. So there are variations in the greens that I see, variations in the reds that I see. I ignore those variations, but I've found a CCD, a conceptual common denominator, something that can be measured along a spectrum. Now, it may not require numeric quantified measurement. It can be comparative measurement. This is more, this is less, this is deeper, this is shorter. It's a comparative, not numeric measurement, but it's still a kind of measurement that commences it, and a kind of measurement omission. Oh, I'm going to ignore the differences between this green and that green, come up with the concept green that applies to everything that I will ever see that is green. So I've now created this open-ended category because I've omitted the particular measurements. Now, when I apply the concept green, I'm not ignoring that it exists in some measurement. And so when I reapply the concept, I plug back in the measurements that are relevant as necessary. This is, of course, a brilliant understanding. It's in effect a kind of way we have of quantifying differences and similarities in order to establish from direct perception the categories that we use. It's in effect defining what it is, the relationship between the percept and the concept. The relationship is a commensurable characteristic, the specific measurements of which we omit to create the unit awareness that it is a cup, or that it is red or green, a member of this category, this concept, which creates a sort of mental file folder. From that, we build up a whole bunch of concepts from our direct, the simple first order concepts. One of them I just gave, action, right? We begin all manner of basic concepts. Everything at the sense perceptual level is axiomatic in one way for Ayn Rand. It's not as though existence and green have two different metaphysical statuses to Ayn Rand. They're both directly given by perception in terms of their substance, but both are also conceptual knowledge. I've generalized from all the things that exist that I see, and I've generalized from all the green things that I've seen to get to this concept. Simple concepts like action directly come from sense perception, but are abstracted. And Ayn Rand gives a much better account of abstraction. And as you pointed out with David Hume and the modern philosophers did not understand concept formation. For them, the nominalists and sensualists, for example, for them, my concept of man is really just a vague memory of Michael, omitting the particulars that make him different from Tom and Bob. And so I have this sort of fuzzy memory of Michael. A fuzzy memory of Michael is my concept man. If it's fuzzy enough to omit the differences between Michael and Bob and Tom, okay, that's fuzzy enough to work as an image. And that's what these sensualists actually said a concept was. They had no understanding of the real connection between perception and concepts. They were desperate for that. As we've just indicated, David Hume could not see causation. Why should I believe that the sun rises tomorrow? Just because it's happened every time, how do I know that it'll happen tomorrow? It's not like observations come with a little flag that comes out, it says, oh, this is necessary, this is causal, this is connected with that. No, all I get is a bunch of sunrises. No necessity to tomorrow at all. Leaps out. Well, necessity, causation, action, these are abstractions. This is conceptual knowledge. If you can't rise to the conceptual level, Mr. Hume, you're never going to understand causation. No discrete experience. And this is literally what all he thought we really had. This green here now. Oh, he understood the greens were even different. So all we're really getting, if I could translate it into words, is a stream of sensory experiences that are all different from one another. So even using that word green is a little iffy in describing Hume here. All we're getting is this green here now, and a stream of these experiences. And if you can't get up to the conceptual level, sorry, David, you're never going to get causation. You're never going to get the axioms. You're never going to get to any of that. So it's absolutely vital that we understand that it is conceptual knowledge and what concepts are. It also provides the model for all subsequent generalization. Ayn Rand gives us the main clue to the issue of induction. When we're working with various concepts in propositional logic, how do we know that our inductive generalization propositionally is true? Well, one of the ironies, of course, of David Hume's assault on cause and effect is that By his time, people did know why the sun rose every morning. Astronomers had already proven that the Earth is round, spins on its axis, and orbits around the sun. So I could tell David Hume, look, the reason why it must rise tomorrow is that we spin on our own axis, we go around the sun. And the only thing that might interrupt that would be, say, a meteor knocking us out of orbit or stopping our rotation. So I can tell you the circumstances, David Hume, under which it won't rise, and the circumstances under which I can be confident that it will rise tomorrow every time. Now, how did they do that? Those astronomers lived in the age of science after the discovery of the scientific method, which was a dramatic development over Aristotle. They used very careful, sort of hatched examples to observe a controlled observation. Now, some people have argued, the objectivist Aristotelian, the late Professor Alan Gotthelf, made this argument to me. He said Aristotle actually had the beginnings of this in biology, controlled observations. And that is science of controlled observation to come up with these first order generalizations that kick off a science. He actually had something that he thought was sort of a primitive equivalent of it. And it's certainly the Aristotelians who in the 16th century were the base for this and provided men like Galileo and Francis Bacon the basis for developing the scientific method. But the scientific method controls the causes, so we can zero in on the exact cause and know with clarity it's this cause and not any other. In effect, the problem of induction had been solved by the time of David Hume, both by the scientific method, where, as Leonard Peikoff so beautifully puts it, we wrest from nature by the scientific method, by our controlled experiment, through our controlled observation, we force from nature a secret, a latent secret of causation from within it. And that by that method, we can be more clear about our induction. Objectivism, though, when it comes to induction, says, wait a minute here. I can't consider any one piece of my knowledge in isolation from the others. So, Aristotle, Hume, if all I have is that all the swans so far are white, I can tell you already that's not good enough. Color is a variable thing in living creatures. When I look at horses, fish, birds, boy, some are bright red, some are blue, some are a mixture of different colors, some are green, some hummingbirds are purple, some hummingbirds are bright green. Oh my God, color varies. Color is so variant in living things, including human beings, that I would be a fool to say, just based upon however many swans I've seen, or however many humans I've seen, all swans are white or all humans are white. That would be a hasty generalization until I have some causal understanding, some connection between the essence of this thing and what it must be. And for that, we need to look across. For example, you used all men are mortal. It's the classic syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Well, how do I know all men are mortal? It's not merely that every single time everybody dies. It's not that. No. I see all kinds of other things. Animals die, fish die, plants die. It's not just humans. Oh, and more than that, we've got this thing called aging. Leonard Peikoff says,
unfortunately.
Very unfortunate, but it's the nature of living organisms. Peikoff makes a very cute point here. He says, look, if we all stayed young and vibrant as we were when we were 18 and suddenly died for no apparent reason, that maybe we could disconnect the two. But no, he says, and he uses himself as an example, the hair turns gray, the aches and pains grow, I become a little slower. And at some point you realize there's only one inevitable end to this process. It's my mortality. I'm falling apart. People age. Animals age. Every species dies. So now instead of looking at just men dying, what I need to do is I need to cut across. Instead of just doing the vertical integration about swans and color, I need to do what we call horizontal integration. What do I know about other animals? What else about aging and death do I know? Or about death do I know? Like aging. Or that death can happen from injury. Wait a minute here. So now I can understand sort of etiological causal mechanisms that can actually cause this death prematurely. Putting all that knowledge together, I can soundly come to the inference all men are mortal. But I'm not doing it simply by enumerating the fact that everyone at a certain point dies. No, 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 that's not the way it works. We have to look across. In fact, no generalization is valid unless I can bring to bear all of my knowledge. And how do we do that? We do it with concepts. The only way for me to organize my knowledge in such a way that I can use all of my knowledge, bring it to bear on every causal question as it's relevant, is the fact that I have these concepts that are valid. Again, it is valid concepts that modern philosophers so desperately needed to answer the problems of David Hume. And Ayn Rand steps in and says, yes, I've got a theory. I know what the relation between percept and concept. I know why we do it. Unit economy. I know the function it serves. And by giving a rich, full account of what concepts are and showing us, yes, it is added knowledge over direct perception, but it's not some vague image, David, of some vague image of man. It is something different. It is a mental unit. It is a mental tool for understanding and integrating the evidence of the senses. So for Ayn Rand, a concept is a man-made tool, in effect, if validly formed and used, will yield me knowledge about reality, allowing me to integrate the data that the senses provide me. For Ayn Rand, knowledge is an integrative operation, an operation where I put together all the aspects of it so that no one aspect of my knowledge is valid apart from any other aspect of it. As her hero John Galt says in Atlas Shrugged, no concept man forms is valid until and unless he can integrate it with all the rest of his knowledge.
Okay, so the basics of concept formation would be this. If I see, for instance, Jim Valiant and a bunch of his pals, and they're at, say, a zoo, right? And at that zoo, there's a bunch of chimpanzees, right? The first thing I'll notice, or one of the first things I'll notice, is that Jim Valiant and his pals differ from these chimpanzees in a fundamental way. And Jim Valiant and his pals are very similar in a way, and the chimpanzees are all similar to one another in a way. So I would identify what's fundamental. What's the main thing that distinguishes them? Obviously, there's a lot of things, the amount of hair, color, size, whatever, but there's a fundamental, and that fundamental is intelligence. Jim Valiant and his pals differ from these chimpanzees when it comes to intelligence. That would be a conceptual common denominator by which I could differentiate the two. But the problem still remains, how do I put Jim Valiant and his buddies into one category, into one concept? And to do that, we rely on measurement omission, right? We say, well, Jim Valiant and all his buddies all have ears. Their ears might differ in size, width, ability to hear, whatever, but they all have ears. They all have eyes. Same thing, differ in color, shape, size, whatever. The height, you can go through any various differences that you have that are differences in measurement. We omit those measurements. We mentioned intelligence. So we would say, well, Jim Valiant is obviously smarter than the rest of his pals.
True, true.
But that doesn't warrant putting
To
him.
just about anyone.
Yeah, we don't put him in a different concept. We omit the degree of intelligence that they all have.
And that's why I think rationality would probably be the thing that I would use. I can distinguish chimpanzees based on what kind of intelligence they have.
Rationality would be better.
We have a different kind of intelligence that can vary, and that's what I would call conceptual reason. They can't do this. They can't operate. See, I can build my concepts up into generalized propositions about the world and do science and do all kinds. I can do history. I can study the chimpanzees and so forth. But you're right. The child comes up, sees a group of chimpanzees, sees a group of people. They could form a valid concept. You know, those hairy ones over there with the long arms, with the arms longer than the legs. I'm going to call X. And the ones over there that aren't so hairy, who have longer legs than arms, and let's say that's the basis on which they distinguished it. Would that be a valid distinction? Yeah. Could they validly distinguish all people from chimpanzees that way? Yes. But as they increase in their knowledge of the difference has to sophisticate. The real differences, they'll come to learn, more of those differences can be explained by the fact that these humans have this intellectual capacity, reason. And although it may differ in measurement, and indeed every other measurement, my 6'4" friend is going to be there, and my 5'7" friend is going to be there, and they're going to be able to say, so they differ in height. They, I'm there with the friends I often normally would bring to a zoo. They differ in race, they differ in sex, they differ in sexual orientation. It just tells you the kind of people I hang out with. And so they don't omit all those measurements of color, gender, informing the concept man, right? And if they're going to stick with this grouping, which is a very important, if this grouping is valid, then I'm going to stick with the grouping based on facts of reality. In fact, the more I learn, the more facts of reality distinguish them. And in fact, to get my handle on all those things that distinguish, say, they don't have senses of humor. They don't do art. They don't do science. Okay, now, what else explains, okay, in order for me to integrate all that I know that differentiates humans from all that I know that differentiates them from chimpanzees, I need to find the most essential quality, the one that explains most of the differences, if not all of the differences. That would be ideal. But if I've got the thing that causally explains the differences between humans and chimpanzees, then I've validly got the definition given my wider context of knowledge. So a definition can change based on my context of knowledge, but it's an integration of everything I know about chimpanzees. It's an integration of everything I know about, and they're summaries of all of my knowledge.
Now, the definition is based on the conceptual common denominator, the characteristic by which we differentiate one entity from another, because that, like you said, is the fundamental characteristic. It's what Aristotle, I guess, would have thought was manness that inhered in things. It actually doesn't. But we can come up with the concept of man based on what fundamentally the most important differentiator is about man from everything else. And, for each thing, whether it be a light, a cup, a snake, a book, whatever, each has a distinguishing characteristic, a fundamental distinguishing characteristic by which we separate it from other entities.
Exactly correct. Getting back to what you said earlier, you were referring to Aristotle's categories. For Aristotle, really things are what are fundamentally, one of the errors that Heraclitus had was this belief that action and change could happen apart from things. Aristotle points out, no, 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 no. If I were to tell you that there was a bunch of running and jumping going on in the next room, and you said, well, who or what is in the next room? And I said, no, it's a near vacuum like space. There's absolutely nothing in that room. I've sucked out all, even the atmosphere from that room. It's completely empty. I said, well, then what the hell is jumping? What the hell is running? No, there's just a bunch of jumping and running in the next room. You'd think I was crazy. Things, and you'd be right. Only things act. Only things act. Only things change. So, Mr. Heraclitus, says Aristotle, if there's no thing, there ain't no change. You couldn't identify this as having changed unless it were the same match in one way. So you see, you've got it all backwards, guys. There's things that things do, actions, there's attributes. The thing is blue, the thing is small, the thing is slippery. So thing, attribute, action, relationship. This is 1 meter apart from that thing, related in space. Or this guy is this guy's friend, related in a different way. So there's relationships, attributes, actions. These are the kind of categories that Aristotle is talking about when he's pointing out that it is things that are fundamental. And everything else, all these other concepts, in effect, metaphysically, are derivative from the fact that things so relate. It is, all knowledge is in this sense a kind of, Eric Peikoff again has these wonderful pithy ways of putting it. If there were just one thing in the universe, we could never know it by the way we know. our knowledge is predicated on the perception of differences and similarities, and as we go up the chain, comparisons and contrasting. All knowledge in this sense is relational. And so if I weren't going about saying, trying to find, well, what is the essential difference between all of these things and the essential difference between all of these things as I'm learning and learning and learning, then my knowledge in effect would be useless. But if my concept is valid, my definition can change over time, and it becomes valid if it actually does encompass, integrate, and incorporate all of my knowledge of that thing up to now. It's a summary of a vast body of knowledge. And so in this way, Ayn Rand is radically different than every other thinker who mostly sees concepts as either sensualists do, this vague image like HUMAD, or as the definition. A concept is its definition. And were I to change my definition at all, I've changed the concept altogether. Ayn Rand says nonsense, nonsense. Properly done definitions summarize all my knowledge of the thing, all those attributes and relationships and so forth.
Definitions can change,
That's
concepts
right.
cannot.
That's right. The membership, the referent stays the same. It's my understanding of the essence that might alter over time as my knowledge increases. But a validly formed concept is important to this entire chain of induction. If it isn't validly formed, again, I'll quote Peikoff, a validly formed concept is a green light to further induction. Whereas an invalidly formed concept, one that doesn't properly group things by their essence in the context that I need them to be defined, then it's going to be a problem. Then I'm going to be thwarted in further inductive inferences.
I think that I just lost my train of thought. It's what I think. My dogs were barking. I got a blister on my hand, and it made me lose my train of thought.
That never happens to me.
But that said, in objectivism, there are two ways that we can check our knowledge or check the validity of our concepts, right? One is that we need to be able to trace back our knowledge to the evidence of the senses. As the base of our knowledge, everything needs to be traced back to reality, back to the evidence of the senses. But the other way is because contradictions can't exist, if a new item of knowledge contradicts a previous item of knowledge, so I can check it. I look at it as a cross is just helpful for me to visualize it that way. Whereas I go down to tie to reality, but side to side to tie it to other concepts. Now, if the new item of knowledge contradicts something I already think, that doesn't necessarily mean the new item of knowledge is wrong. It might be the old item of knowledge is wrong, but nonetheless, one will have to go. But if the previous item of knowledge was properly integrated, and assuming my other knowledge is correct, then the new item would be incorrect.
It's usually invalid concepts that screw us up in the first place. Philosophers were trying to figure out how God works into everything. And modern philosophers, whether it's Descartes, Locke, Leibniz, Berkeley, Kant, these guys are trying to figure out how to make sense of a universe that would have a God in it. And that concept is warping their thought from beginning to end. And you can see it all over their work. So that, take the subject of philosophy. In developing the subject of philosophy, they're getting messed up by trying to work in and try and understand a concept that cannot be reduced to observation. And you're absolutely right. Test one, no matter how high the abstraction, liberty, reason, you name it, the most broad, the most general abstraction you can name, some scientific principle, no matter how abstract, you've got, and you realize that as we develop concepts, Ayn Rand recognized they're not all just related to direct perception. We come to a point where we have abstractions on top of abstractions, where we build a whole chain of conceptual knowledge that in effect takes us further and further away from direct observation. And it becomes, as we move up into the higher orders of abstraction, all the more critical that we're constantly chaining it back down to the observations and reality that support it. And going back to you've got to be able to trace your step all the way back down to the observations, and hopefully the whole range of observations that supported your concept. So direct observation is the test of validity. But as you point out, I've got to integrate that with all the rest of my knowledge in a consistent way. Therefore, I've got to interrelate every single one of my concepts as I'm moving up the chain of abstraction, so that my knowledge is my knowledge is a unity, an integrated whole, a single structure that has its foundational roots in observation and is logically interconnected. And in fact, the more beams I shoot out across, the stronger my structure, the more flying buttresses I can have interrelating and integrating, right? So the more integration, everything, the tighter the integration. And if they're all based on observation and only observation of reality, and if I have tightly integrated it completely with integration, then and only then do I have what Ayn Rand would call valid knowledge. That is the test of knowledge for her. A complete integration. You know, there's sometimes in modern epistemology, they'll say, are you a foundationalist or are you a coherence theorist? Men like Hegel had dispensed with reality. He was a subjective idealist of the most extreme kind. He'd done away with Kant's noumenal world. And so to him, the only test of validity is, unlike Aristotle's test of truth. What does truth mean to Aristotle? Well, look, my sense perception is valid, says Aristotle, because I'm directly looking at the thing. My concept is valid if it corresponds to reality. If this idea has a corresponding referent reality, it's true. Hegel can't do that, can he? Because he doesn't have reality. So he says the test of truth is integration, coherence. Can I integrate my ideas, in effect, in such a way that they're perfectly logically interconsistent? Ayn Rand believes that both are vital tests. So she is both a foundationalist in the sense that she requires it to be reduced to observation in every instance, but she's also an integrationist. I won't use the term coherence because that could imply Hegelianism. She believes in what she would call integration. She defines reason as the faculty which identifies and integrates the material of man's senses. The real difference between Ayn Rand, who agrees with Aristotle's correspondence theory, by the way, and Aristotle also has a degree of integration that he demands and requires, at least within each discrete subject. Each science must be fully integrated. And that's one of the tests as we're moving up the chain of these correlations, these provisional inductions that get us to our axiom, from which we can then deduce the science with certainty. It's not only that Ayn Rand says, no, your inductions have to be on their own valid as you're building up, or the conclusion when you get up there and deduce back won't be any more valid than the premises that got you there in the first place. And for that, we need a theory of concepts. The other big difference is Aristotle did, for all of his achievements, because you see, he did provide the valid outline of how humans know. He provided an account of how humans come to know when they validly come to know, better than anyone up to that point, and probably subsequent, with the modifications of the additions of, say, the scientific method. He said something that screwed up philosophy very badly in the field of epistemology. He implied, and he replied it repeatedly, that if our awareness really had a particular process, a mechanism, a specific nature, it would not perfectly and clearly reflect, i.e., correspond to the truth that it is. So we better hope our concepts are completely formed in a process-free, no mechanism of coming to be. Well, I better just see the horseness in that horse. And if I'm not seeing directly, almost through a diaphanous pane of glass, consciousness must, if I can use Ayn Rand's term, consciousness cannot possess identity. If it possessed an identity, it would thereby be invalid and distorting. And boy, did modern philosophers fall prey to this. It will climax this error. Now, Aristotle never conceived of anything so monstrously distorted and evil as Kant, but it will climax in Kant's philosophy to the point that no. All necessity is provided by the mind. So logic, entity, causality, that's mind provided. It's not true of reality at all. It's the way I have to see the world and think about the world. And it's these categories and these forms of perception that necessitate how I see things in terms of being objects, being causal, etc. Now, Ayn Rand says, in effect, he's blaming, his argument would be true against any consciousness. If consciousness exists, it's like everything else that exists. It possesses an identity. It has a specific nature. It must work by a specific causal process. If it did not, it could not work. It could not exist. The condition of existence is to possess identity. So like everything else that exists, consciousness has a specific nature. It works by a specific means. It produces its results in a specific form. And that is not disqualifying. That is what makes it possible. That's the qualifying nature of it. And so for her, the fact that our senses are physical and automatic, that's that validity right there. All the problems are conceptual misinterpretation of what the automatic results of my sense perception is. People will say it's an optical illusion when we look at train tracks, because they really don't converge. They stay the same distance apart. And yet I see them, it looks like they're converging. No, if they didn't, I wouldn't be given knowledge of distance either. So my senses are giving me a composite set of information that I have to conceptually identify correctly. It is no illusion. Every time I look at the train tracks, they appear to converge. Every time. That's what makes them valid. The problem is my conceptual identification of it. Furthermore, my concepts themselves, conceptualization is a specific process. Concepts themselves are a specific form and tool of knowledge. It has to be that way. So in effect, what these philosophers are saying, as Ayn Rand so eloquently puts it, we're blind because we have eyes, deaf because we have ears, deluded because we have a mind. And it was Aristotle who kicked that off, unfortunately, even though he did give us the magnificently, at least in essence, correct account of how humans come to know. He made big mistakes. He had certain gaps, but geez, that's expecting a lot from Aristotle, who, after all, did a lot. The things that modern philosophy needed to really get, you focused on a couple of them. For example, it's the relationship. Descartes starts off philosophy by saying, look, how do I know everything isn't a hallucination, a dream? How do I know I'm not being deceived by some evil demon rather than living in a universe created by God? And so he questions everything. Anything is possible when it comes to doubting knowledge. Well, no, that's whim worship. Metaphysically, not everything is possible. As we pointed out, what's possible is already contained in the nature of the thing. What is? So not everything is metaphysically possible. Now, epistemologically, if I'm saying possible, probable, certain, I'm assessing evidence where there is no evidence at all. There is no possibility to assess. There's no cognitive connection to my knowledge, whatever. And if someone just asserts something out of the thin blue sky, again, I'll use a Peikoff example. Imagine there's a convention of gremlins on Mars reading Hegel. It would be a mistake to even attempt to refute it. Until and unless someone provides at least some evidence that it is possible, you can dismiss them and must dismiss them out of hand. Otherwise, you'd be demanding what we call in logic proof of negative. Now, Descartes, the famous French philosopher, he knew logic. He wouldn't have demanded you prove a negative. He understood the burden of proof when it came to certain knowledge or probable knowledge. But when it comes to possibility, he thought anything goes. No, it is not possible in every instance. Look, after I've covered all the evidence, after I've surveyed everything I know, it's perfectly logical. I've been very rigorous. I've checked and double checked. I've asked other people even. There's no reason to believe. Someone says, well, still, maybe you're wrong, Jim. No, I've accounted for the possibility of error by accounting for all of the evidence in a perfectly logical way. You give me some indication that I might be mistaken. You can't just assert this possibility out of the blue. Again, it's a giant stolen concept. And the best way to approach your Cartesian is simply to say, what do you mean hallucination? What do you mean dream? What do you mean error? No, there's no such thing as error. No one is ever mistaken. And of course, the Cartesian will come back, no, what you think sometimes doesn't correspond to reality. Well, how would you know that if you never had knowledge of reality? You have to know that this is the truth, or you don't get the concept of error. I could never form the concept of dream if I didn't say, well, that dream is a departure from, it wasn't a direct perception of reality at all. It was a dream I had last night. Oh, so what I do is I say, no such thing as hallucination. Oh, and then they'll give you some eloquent demonstration of how we know that was a hallucination because we had the truth. That's what all this depends upon. This hierarchy of knowledge, this structure of conceptual knowledge, Ayn Rand was very, very keen on. And that she did get inspired from by Aristotle. But you see, she took Aristotle a step further. Consciousness has an identity. It must have an identity. That's what refutes this general skepticism. And that's what refutes mysticism. Because there ain't no magical knowledge either. I ask, you say, I believe in God or magic elves. How do you know? The fact that an idea pops into your head does not guarantee its reality out there. And
Thank
so,
God.
yeah. So method requires that you demonstrate your idea. Method demonstrates your idea. And if you can't distinguish between the demonstrated and the undemonstrated, then you're going to either be a universal skeptic because you don't appreciate the consciousness must possess an identity, or you're going to be a mystic who simply skips the how and gets to their what, and even they recognize though it's a pseudo how.
And how would Miss Rand to ask if you were a mystic, Jim?
Some sort of mystic.
Awesome. All right, Jim. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Where can people find you, Jim?
I am on Facebook every day, answering questions about philosophy, answering questions about history, answering questions about Ayn Rand, answering questions about religion and Christianity. Come see me at Facebook. I also do a regular appearance at podcasts at the Ayn Rand Center, United Kingdom, where you'll hear me pontificate about, well, currently we're focused on the war going on in Israel. So these days you'll hear my strong opinion on that subject. But I otherwise have a book with a website, www.creatingchrist.com, if you're interested in the origins of Christianity and my take on that.
Awesome, Jim. Thank you so much for being here, and I can't wait to have you back again.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Until next time.